Have you ever imagined waking up tomorrow and discovering that the greatest war in history never happened just in the past? What if, right now, as you watch this video, an invisible battle is raging all around you? A battle that doesn't appear in the newspapers. It doesn't appear on social media. It cannot be filmed by cameras, but which, according to the scriptures, influences destinies, decisions, and even the direction of humanity. Most people believe that the war between God and Satan is just ancient history, a distant event, something that began in heaven thousands of years ago and ended when Lucifer was expelled from the divine presence. But there is a detail that few realize. The Bible never says that this war is over. In fact, it suggests exactly the opposite. What if the conflicts we see in the world are just the surface of something much bigger? What if behind the chaos, the confusion, the increasing violence, the destruction of values, and the growing sense that something is wrong, there is a spiritual battle going on a scale we can barely comprehend? This question may seem far-fetched until you start connecting the dots, because there is a curious pattern running through the entire biblical narrative, from Genesis to Revelation, from the Garden of Eden to the final events described in the prophecies. The same war appears again and again. The characters change, times change, empires arise and disappear, but the conflict continues, and that is precisely what makes this subject so unsettling. If this battle is still going on, then it is not just a matter of the past. It also involves the present, and maybe it involves you. But before understanding how this would be possible, we need to go back to a moment that, according to biblical texts, changed not only the history of the earth, but spiritual reality itself. A moment in which a being described as glorious made a decision that triggered consequences that continue to echo today. And here's the most impressive part. This story does not begin in hell. It doesn't start with men. It doesn't even start on earth. It starts in heaven. But then an uncomfortable question arises. How could a rebellion be born in a perfect place? How could a conflict arise precisely where there should be no conflict? And most importantly, if something like this happened once, what guarantees that the effects of this rebellion are not reaching the world to this day? Because some scholars observe a detail that is little commented on. Lucifer's fall may not have been just an isolated event. She may have started a lawsuit, a process that continues to unfold before our eyes. And this is exactly where everything starts to get even more intriguing. Because to understand modern-day spiritual warfare, we first need to understand how this war began. And when we look at the beginning of this story, we find something that completely changes the way many people see reality. There is an idea that almost no one takes seriously. That spiritual warfare was not trapped in some ancient page of the Bible. She continues, silent, undercover, operating behind human choices, thoughts, cultures, systems, and desires. And maybe that's why she's so dangerous. Because a visible war is scary, but an invisible war convinces you that there is no war at all. Think about that for a moment. If the enemy wanted to win a spiritual battle, would he appear obviously, or would you work in secret, making everything seem normal? This is where the big question of this video arises. And if Satan's greatest strategy isn't to make people believe in him, but making people forget they are at war? Because when someone forgets that there is a battle, they stop watching. When you stop watching, you let your guard down. And when you let your guard down, you start calling freedom what could be a trap. But there is an even deeper detail. Lucifer's rebellion was not just an opposition against God. It was an attempt to change the order, to invert values, to place the creature in the center of exchanging obedience for pride. And that hasn't disappeared. The same logic keeps repeating itself in the human heart, in secret decisions, in the way the world calls light delay and darkness progress. What began in heaven found an echo on earth, and that connection is scary because it shows that the conflict is not far away. He approaches, it touches the mind. He fights for attention. He whispers ideas. He tries to turn small concessions into big falls. But the most disturbing revelation is yet to come. Because, according to the biblical narrative, this battle does not just involve Satan and his angels. It involves Miguel. It involves the sky. It involves the earth. It involves the end of times. And it involves a choice that each person makes, even when they believe they are not choosing anything. The question is, which side is a person on when they don't realize that there is one side? That's what makes this war so silent and so urgent. Before Earth felt the effects of this war, something had already happened elsewhere. And that changes everything, because when talking about a spiritual fall, many people only imagine a shadowy, distant figure already defeated, removed from everything. But the narrative begins very differently. It starts with beauty, with position, with glory, with proximity. Lucifer does not appear first as an enemy. He appears as someone who has been in a high place. And that is precisely what makes the story so disturbing, because the rebellion was not born in chaos, born close to order. He was not born in darkness. He was born where there was light. And then the uncomfortable question arises, how did pride get in there? This is the point that almost no one notices. The fall did not begin with an external battle. It started with an internal change, a wish, a comparison, a desire to rise beyond the limit, something silent before becoming open. And maybe that's why this story still speaks so much to the present, because many falls don't start with great acts. They start with small, hidden, almost justifiable thoughts. But there is one detail. When Lucifer rebelled, he didn't just turn down a position, he questioned an authority. And in doing so, he opened a rupture, a spiritual crack, something that was not contained within him. The rebellion spread, influenced others. It created division. It turned worship into dispute. And this is where the past begins to touch the now, because the same logic is still repeated. First comes seduction, then doubt, then inversion. Evil rarely presents itself as evil. It presents itself as an advantage, like freedom, as right, like a voice saying, you can be more. But more than what? And at what price? Lucifer's fall shows that spiritual conflict does not necessarily begin with monsters, shadows, or frightening signs. It begins when the creature tries to take the place of the Creator. And if that was the first movement of war, then perhaps the battlefield was never just the sky. Maybe it was always the heart too, because after that decision, nothing remained the same. And the next scene in this story isn't just an expulsion, it's a war. Then the tension changes shape. What began as hidden pride turns into open confrontation. And the Bible describes a scene that seems short but carries immense weight. There was a battle in heaven. Michael and his angels fought the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought too. Realize the size of this. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was war. And not just anywhere, in heaven. The place that many imagine as absolute silence, untouchable peace, and perfect order appears for a moment as a scene of conflict. But there is a detail that makes everything deeper. Miguel does not appear as a random figure. He appears as a warrior, as commander, as one who stands up against rebellion. And Satan appears in another way, not just as a tempter, but as an organized opponent. This reveals something important. Evil does not always act in a confused way. Sometimes he acts strategically, with influence, with the appearance of strength, with the ability to drag others along. But the question is inevitable. If Satan was defeated in heaven, why is there still so much destruction on earth? This is where the story opens up a frightening gap. Because expulsion does not mean absence of activity. It means changing territory. The conflict does not disappear. He goes down. And when he descends, he finds humanity. Michael's victory shows that the rebellion did not win in heaven. But the presence of evil on earth shows that the battle still has effects. And perhaps that is why the world so often seems to be divided between two forces, one that calls for the truth, another that distorts, one that points to God, another that promises total autonomy. And in the middle of this is the human being, listening to voices, making decisions, believing that everything is just personal choice. But what if some choices are more spiritual than they seem? Because after the battle in the sky, the war did not end. She just got closer. And the battlefield is now much more intimate than many imagine. So far, this story may seem distant. A war in heaven, angels, Miguel, Satan, events that happened long before any civilization existed. But this is exactly where most people miss the most important detail. Because the true impact of this war is not just where it started. That's where she continues. And this is where everything becomes personal. Very personal. After all, if Satan was cast out of heaven, where did his influence go? If the rebellion was unable to remain in the presence of God, where did it begin to act? The writings yours present a disturbing response. Earth became part of this conflict. And that means the battlefield has changed, but not in the way many imagine. We are not just talking about visible supernatural events. We are not talking about extraordinary phenomena happening every day. Spiritual warfare has become much more sophisticated, much quieter, much closer, because it started to happen within human decisions, inside ideas, within beliefs, within the values that a society accepts or rejects. And maybe that's exactly why so many people don't realize its existence. Think for a moment. Almost no big lie presents itself as a lie. It usually comes across as true, or at least looking harmless. This pattern appears from the beginning. In the Garden of Eden, the serpent did not begin with a threat. It started with a question, a doubt, a suggestion, a small distortion, and the result was much greater than it seemed at the time. But there is one detail that almost no one notices. The strategy hasn't changed as much as we thought. Even today, many battles begin the same way, with small concessions, with small deviations, with small justifications. Nothing seems serious at first. Nothing seems dangerous. Nothing seems capable of changing a destiny, until the sum of these small choices produces enormous consequences. And that is precisely what makes this war so difficult to see, because it rarely happens spectacularly. It happens on a routine basis. In the thought you feed, in fact, you accept it. In the lie, you decide to believe. In the direction you choose to go. And here, an uncomfortable question arises. How many decisions that we consider completely normal could be being influenced by something we cannot see? This question is scary because it forces us to look beyond the surface. It forces us to consider that perhaps there is a fight going on for people's minds, attention, and hearts. But then something even more intriguing emerges. If this war really happens around us every day, how can we recognize its signs? Because there are signs that many ignore, patterns that go unnoticed, movements that seem common. But when observed carefully, they reveal that the conflict is much closer than we imagine. And it is exactly at this point that the tension of this story really begins to increase. If this war really keeps going on, there is a reason why so many people fail to notice it. And that reason may be more worrying than the battle itself. Because the most dangerous conflicts are not always the ones we see. These are the ones we learn to consider normal. Think about the world around you for a moment. We live in the information age. There has never been so much knowledge available. There have never been so many forms of communication. There has never been so much access to answers. But at the same time, the confusion seems to be growing. Anxiety grows. The truth becomes increasingly difficult to identify. People disagree about almost everything. Values previously considered fundamental are now being questioned. Right and wrong seem to constantly change. And the inevitable question is this just a natural transformation of society? Or is there something else going on? This is where many scripture scholars draw attention to a little examined detail. One of the main weapons attributed to Satan is not strength. It's the deception, not immediate destruction. But the distortion is gradual, not imposition, but the seduction. And when we understand this, we begin to see this war in a different way. Because an effective lie doesn't have to be completely false. It just needs to be close enough to the truth to appear credible. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the biblical narrative, and it continues to appear in the human experience. But there is a detail that makes everything even more unsettling. Deception rarely announces its presence. He presents himself as a solution, how to advance, as a benefit, like something that seems to make sense. And that's exactly why so many people are attracted to it. Because no one consciously chooses to be deceived. People choose what they believe to be true. And this is where the invisible conflict becomes extremely dangerous. Because it happens in the mind before appearing in actions. It happens in beliefs before appearing in behaviors. It happens inside before manifesting outside. And if there is a battle for the mind, then attention becomes a contested territory. Thoughts become contested territory. Convictions become contested territory. Maybe that's why so many people feel a constant struggle between what they know they should do and what they feel like doing. A silent tension, an internal conflict, a resistance that is difficult to explain. But then a question arises, it's even deeper. If the goal of spiritual warfare is to influence people, how can we identify when we are being influenced? Because not every voice comes shouting. Not all influence appears evidently. Some arrive slowly, almost imperceptibly, changing priorities, changing perceptions, redefining limits. And when we realize it, we are already thinking in a completely different way than we did before. But this is where everything starts to escalate, because according to biblical prophecies, the objective of this war is not just to influence isolated individuals. There is something bigger, something that involves nations, cultures, global movements, and events that point to a future outcome. An outcome that the book of Revelation impressively describes. And when we get to this part of the story, we understand that the war in heaven was not just the beginning of a conflict, it was the beginning of a countdown. A countdown that, according to many interpreters of the prophecies, is advancing towards a decisive moment. And the most intriguing thing of all is that the signs of this moment may be much closer than most imagine. Everything we've seen so far points to an inevitable conclusion. The war did not end. She evolved, and it is exactly in the book of Revelation that this reality appears most intensely. Because Revelation does not just describe future events. It reveals the spiritual backstage behind human history. And when these curtains begin to open, the dimension of the conflict becomes much greater than it seems. Most people imagine the apocalypse as just a sequence of catastrophes, wars, crises, judgments, extraordinary signs. But there is something prior to all this, something that almost always goes unnoticed. Before the visible events, there is an invisible dispute, a contest for loyalty, for worship, by influence, by authority. And this is where the narrative becomes surprising, because Revelation shows that Satan does not abandon his rebellion. Even after the defeat, even after expulsion, even knowing what the end result will be, he continues. And this persistence reveals something important. The goal was never just to defy God. The goal has always been to gain followers, drag as many people as possible away from the truth. But there is one detail that completely changes the way we see this story. The conflict described in Revelation does not just happen between spiritual forces. It manifests itself within humanity itself, in collective decisions, in individual choices, in the systems that shape entire societies. And that's why prophecies talk so often about deception, because the battlefield remains the mind, it remains the heart, it remains the human capacity to discern. And here comes a question that few ask. Why does Revelation insist so much on the idea of surveillance? Why is there a constant warning to stay alert? Perhaps because the greatest danger is not recognizing evil. Perhaps the biggest danger is confusing it with something good. And it is exactly at this point that the tension increases, because the prophecies describe a period in which the distinction between truth and lies becomes increasingly difficult for many people. Everything seems mixed up. Everything seems relative. Everything seems negotiable. But according to the biblical text, there is a reason for this. The war is reaching its most decisive moment, and as a battle nears its end, the intensity typically increases. Strategies become more aggressive. Movements become faster. The consequences become greater. But there is something even more impressive, Amid all the powerful images of Revelation, there is one message that remains constant. God remains in control. This is the part that many ignore, because by just looking at the chaos, it's easy to believe that evil is winning. By simply observing the crises, it is easy to imagine that the darkness is advancing without resistance. But Revelation presents a completely different perspective. It shows conflict, it shows suffering, shows opposition, but it also shows limits, shows purpose. It shows an already defined outcome. And this is exactly where a question arises that changes everything. If the final outcome is already determined, why does the battle continue? Why does God allow this conflict to run its course? Why does humanity still participate in this story? The answer to these questions takes us to an even deeper dimension of spiritual warfare, because the stakes can be much greater than simply winning or losing a battle. It may involve something that affects every person alive, something that directly connects heaven, earth, and the destiny of humanity. And when that connection becomes clear, spiritual warfare stops seeming like a distant event. She goes on to explain much more about the world today than most people imagine. Ina, if there is one thing Revelation makes clear, it is this: heaven and earth were never separated as many people imagine. What happens in the spiritual world echoes in the human world, and what happens between the men reveals signs of a much bigger war. This is the point that changes everything, because when we only look at the surface, we see crises, choices, conflicts, and changes. But when we look through the biblical lens, we begin to notice patterns. Nothing seems isolated. Nothing seems random. Lucifer's fall was not just a distant episode. It opened a dispute that spans generations. And this dispute appears in the temptations of Eden, in the empires that rose up against God, in persecutions, in false promises, in distortions of the truth, and in the constant struggle for the human soul. But there is one detail. This war doesn't just try to destroy bodies. She tries to redefine meanings. What is true? What is fine? What is freedom? What is obedience? What is worship? Do you see how this approaches the present? Perhaps the greatest battlefield of our time is not a physical place. Maybe it's the interpretation of reality. Because if Satan can distort the way a person understands God, understands themselves, and understands the world, he doesn't need to show up. He has already influenced the direction. And this is where the connection between heaven and earth becomes frighteningly practical. An idea may seem small, but an idea can change a life. A lie may seem harmless, but a repeated lie can form an entire generation, and a confused generation can unknowingly walk away from the truth. So the question is not just, is there spiritual warfare? The deeper question is, how is this war shaping what I consider normal? Because perhaps many signs don't come with supernatural appearance. Maybe they come as a distraction, like pride, like indifference, like spiritual coldness, like a silent voice saying, none of this matters. But if none of that mattered, why would there be so much contention? Why would the scriptures talk so much about surveillance? Why would Revelation warn so many times about deception? There is something bigger at stake, something that connects heaven, earth, and every human decision. And when we understand this, war is no longer distant. She becomes close. So close that the next question may be the most difficult of all. What if Lucifer's fall is still repeating itself, not in heaven, but within human choices? The fall of Lucifer is not just a story about a fallen angel. It's a story about a choice that keeps repeating itself. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable part of all, because it's easy to look at Satan as someone distant, an external enemy, a figure separate from our reality. But the fall pattern may appear much closer than we imagine. Every time pride takes the place of humility, every time the creature tries to live as if it didn't need the Creator, every time the truth is exchanged for convenience, every time personal will becomes more important than God's will, the logic of rebellion reappears, not with wings, not with fire, not with a dramatic scene, but in common decisions, silent, daily. And that's what makes this war so serious, because perhaps the most dangerous battle is not the one that takes place before our eyes. Maybe it's the one that happens when no one is watching, in secret thought, in hidden choice, in the small concession that doesn't seem to change anything, but it changes little by little. And here's the question no one can avoid. If this war involves every human being, which part of us is being fought over now? The attention, faith, conscience, the desire, or all of this at the same time? Because the fall continues whenever someone turns away from the light, believing they are just following their own path. And the problem is that falling away rarely feels like falling off at first. It feels like autonomy. It feels like control. It feels like freedom, until at some point the person realizes that something inside them has cooled down. And perhaps this is one of the most subtle signs of spiritual warfare, not just external chaos, but the internal loss of sensitivity. When the error no longer bothers you, when the truth no longer attracts, when God seems distant, but distraction always seems available. And this is where everything gets urgent, because if the war began with a choice, it also reveals itself in choices. And each choice points in a direction, even when no one notices, even when no one admits it, even when it seems too small to matter. But is there really anything small in a war for the fate of the soul? This question paves the way for the final point, because every war moves toward an outcome, and this one also walks. Every war has an end. Every rebellion finds its limit. Every choice produces a consequence. And, according to the biblical narrative, the war started by Lucifer is also heading towards a definitive end. Bad. There's just something curious. When people think of the final judgment, they usually imagine only punishment, just condemnation, just the end of a story. But the scriptures present something much greater. The trial appears as the conclusion of an issue that spans the entire existence of this war. The question of authority, the question of truth, the question of who really deserves trust. Because from the beginning, the rebellion cast doubt. A doubt about God, about His character, about His purposes, about His authority. And all of human history happened within this great dispute. But then comes the moment when all the masks fall. The moment when deception can no longer hide. The moment when what was hidden becomes visible. And that's exactly what makes the outcome so important, not because God needs to prove something to Himself, but because all creation will see the full result of this war. You will see where pride leads. You will see where the rebellion leads. You will see where the truth leads. And you will see that no choice was insignificant. But there is a detail that makes this reflection deeply personal. The final judgment is not just the end of Satan's story. It is also the moment when each person confronts what they have made with the choices they have received. And this completely changes the way we look at this war, because it is no longer just a narrative about angels. It stops being just a story about heaven. It is no longer just a distant prophecy. It becomes a question of direction, on purpose, of destiny. And here comes one of the most important questions in this entire video. If spiritual warfare really is happening all around us, if it influences thoughts, values, and decisions, if it goes through history since the beginning of humanity. So what is the correct answer? The Bible repeatedly points in the same direction: surveillance, discernment, fidelity. Not because fear is the answer, but because the truth needs to be recognized. And perhaps that is exactly why so many biblical passages insist on remaining awake. Pay attention, prepared. Because a spiritually asleep person may not realize when they are drifting away, but a vigilant person can identify what tries to lead them astray. And this is where this whole journey returns to where we started. The war in heaven, the fall of Lucifer, Miguel's battle, the conflict described in Revelation. All of this points to a question that remains open to this day. A question that each generation needed to answer. A question that you may be answering right now without even realizing it. Because if the war continues, if the battle for the truth continues, if the fight for the human heart continues. So the question is no longer whether you are part of it. The question is another. When this story finally reaches its final chapter, when the conflict started in heaven finds its definitive end, when the whole truth is revealed, which side will your choices have shown you to be on? And perhaps the answer to that question is much more important than most people realize. Because the war can end, but the consequences of the choices made during it remain forever. And that's a reflection worth carrying long after this video ends.